I'm joined today by a man named Paul. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Now, you work for Christian Concern, and we want to get into that a little bit. We've got some other stuff we wanted to talk about as well. But for those who've never heard of Christian Concern, who might think it's something to do with being concerned about Christians or even for Christians, what's Christian Concern all about?
Thanks. Yes, well, we're about bringing the hope of Jesus Christ to the heart of society. So we work particularly in the areas of the law and Parliament and the media to try and just try and show that hope of Christ and to put it back at the heart of our nation, because we believe that God's plan for humanity, as we kind of read in the Bible, is the best for everybody. And so we want to share that with people and to try and see our laws and our policies and the courts and everything transformed by Jesus Christ for the good of all.
One of the things I do randomly know is, for example, the probation service, National Probation Service. I know UK, US probation officers are slightly different roles, but here in the UK, it's largely to do with people who've been in prison, coming out of prison. The probation service then steps in to try and get people to stop reoffending or to reintegrate into society. But I do know that the probation service was actually set up by the church originally. It was a Christian outreach, effectively, to try and help people who were in prisons not be in prison anymore. So there are some amazing Christian origin establishments that we may not know that's where even the education system was largely because of the church, that we don't necessarily think of. Well, the church actually started that.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you look at virtually any institution you can think of in this country, you'll find a Christian history there. With pretty much all of these places, you'll find writings on the wall of buildings that people are still using today. You'll see, if you go to any kind of major charity, you'll probably find that its founders were Christians back in the 1800s, or these sorts of things. So yeah, it's been such a foundational part of our nation, and yet as Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, we tend to think of our calling sometimes as a bit more narrow and just about evangelizing people, maybe just doing good on small scale to people around us, which is obviously so important. But historically, Christians have had a much bigger vision for what it means for the whole nation to follow Christ.
Even a court system at the most rudimentary levels is about saying, if you do something that is wrong, according to our laws, there will be a consequence. Well, that's kind of exactly the whole point of Christianity, saying, well, if you do it this way, there's going to be a consequence. So why not come this way instead? And then the consequence is better for you in terms of salvation, in terms of going to heaven when you die. So even in the court system at the most basic levels, we see such parity with how the Christian faith actually exists.
Yeah, our whole legal system is based on the common law tradition, which goes back all the way to King Alfred, before there was even England, and he was explicitly basing these things on the biblical law. So it is so thoroughly integrated into our understanding of law and justice that we don't even see it. Like, it's just all so it's the air we breathe, as Glenn Scrivener has written. It's just something that comes naturally to us, and we don't even recognize that it's Christian in origin.
I remember I've quoted this quite a few times over the months, but Andy Hawthorne was speaking at a prayer breakfast, and he was talking about the state of the UK, some of the work, obviously the Message does up in Manchester, which is the organisation that he set up. But he was talking about how there's a lot of Christianity in all sorts of spheres, which is what we've already been discussing. But he said everything starts shaking when we stop trying to keep God in the center of what we do. And as a society, we've had God in the center. I'm badly paraphrasing this. God was in the center of all we did, and then we took God away, and then we wonder why things are starting to collapse. But as you've already sort of alluded, well, not even alluded, stated, there are lots of places where the church was the origin of that organization. I brought up the probation service. It's just one I read at the history of once. But even that one, it's rooted in Christianity and the Christian faith. So when you start to try and strip away Christianity, you're not just taking away the Christian faith, you're stripping away the very foundations of some of these amazing organizations that have done such great things for the UK.
Something really interesting along these lines is happening at the moment, in that there are lots of influential people who are saying that they're cultural Christians or something to that degree. So the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, I believe, has called herself a cultural Christian, although she doesn't believe in Jesus or these sorts of things. And people like Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, kind of lining himself up in a sense with cultural Christianity, and lots of people like that who have recognized some of the problems with all of the alternatives to Christianity as far as how we build our nation and how we understand justice and these sorts of things, free speech, these sorts of things. So they're recognizing the problems and they're going, well, culturally, I want to go back to something that's a bit more like what it was with Christianity. And yet, and obviously I want to say yes to that, except that it doesn't work without Jesus. It doesn't work without the real God blessing us. And blessing our efforts. So we can't just have the cultural Christianity without Christ, is what I'd say.
Coming back to that prayer breakfast Andy Hawthorne did a number of years ago, Jesus is the only thing that makes this all work. And again, bad paraphrase, but it's so true that you can't just take a piece and say, oh, we don't like that bit, so we'll get rid of this bit, because then everything becomes imbalanced. And what do you balance it with? Well, you've got to fill the gap with something. And if you rip something out, there's going to be a hole. What are you going to fill it up with? Well, if you take away the good, it's not necessarily going to fill with anything good, just at most basic logical levels.
Yeah. And as we know, like Christianity has lots of beliefs, lots of teachings and things that are important, but it is fundamentally about a person, Jesus Christ, and how he brings us to the Father. And we just can't we can't treat Christianity like another set of ideas like communism or libertarianism or what other kind of isms, because it's not just about a set of beliefs. It's actually about person.
Amen to that. Right, let's go back in time a little bit for you then. You're working for an organization that's working in the church, or for the church in a sense. What's your story of faith as a person? You're talking about a personal relationship with Jesus. It's coming out of how you talk. But how did you find that? What's your encounter with Jesus?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I was brought up in a household. We went to church, local Church of England church, a good one. And I came to believe and understand lots of the things, lots of the teachings of Scripture. But but it wasn't really it wasn't a relationship at that point, and it hadn't become real to me. I actually kind of got quite into philosophy and kind of reading and understanding a little bit about that from reading a book called Sophie's World, which is just a quite interesting novel about philosophy. So I got quite into that area, and I actually came convinced that there was a God through some of that and some of the arguments, the kind of old school philosophical arguments for God. And then just shortly after that, I was going on some ventures, some like camps back in well, the one I went to is in near Taunton. It's down in the southwest, and it was there that I first really heard the gospel. I'm sure it was said to me a million times before that, but it was first that I really understood what Jesus was calling me to and what it meant to be a Christian. And at that point, I said, yes, this is definitely for me. It took a while for it to really start working its way into my life in the way that it should have done. But as I kept on going to these sorts of things and going on to Christian youth group, then I started to really understand what that was about and take it more seriously. And so I followed him ever since.
I've read quite a lot of accounts of people who have lived a life, as they would describe it, was godless. They weren't Christians. They didn't care about religion or Christianity. And then there's a moment of an encounter that changes their life. But that change seems to, on average, from at least many dozens of testimonies I've read, it's like a 2-3 year period. It's not like I'm going to be a Christian. Oh, great, here I am. Actually, okay, I want to follow this Jesus guy. He sort of sounds kind of interesting. And actually, I feel like this is a good thing to do. But then the transference of who you were to what you're becoming, it seems to, and this is not scientific, but anyway, but it's about 2-3 years of kind of gradual process, because I think God is very much a gentleman of changing us from who we were to the beginning of who he wants us to be. It's not like aggressive and really violent change, from what I can read anyway. It seems to be quite a slow, gentle process. I don't know what you think, maybe sort of 2-3 years of, I wasn't a Christian and now I am, but it's not like an overnight thing. It does seem to be a couple of years involved.
That often is the case. Yeah. I mean, often when someone grows up in in a Christian household or kind of around Christian influences, then it often seems a bit more gradual rather than a sudden light bulb moment, in a sense. Often it is around when you're 13 or 14 that it becomes kind of a real thing for you. It's that can be the case. But one delight at working at Christian Concern is I get to talk to lots of people over the years. I mean, I've worked there for 15 years. I've talked to lots of people about how they've come to know Jesus from all kinds of origins. So lots of people, we have lots of people on our team who are from other countries as well, and different parts of the church. So it's not just my own circles. And to hear the difference in stories, some people who've just been brought up in Christian families and they can't remember a time when they didn't know the Lord, through to the super dramatic conversion stories that we also hear. And to me, every single one is a delight. God works in all kinds of ways, but you see his hand at work through the ordinary sorts of things and the extraordinary things.
What an amazing privilege to have that. My wife and I have very, very different experiences. I was brought up in a church context. So by the age of 7, I decided I want to follow Jesus. But Joe was in Lyon, France, where there's not a lot of Christianity going on, actually. And that's where she had a very, very spiritual, dramatic encounter of God and decided to follow God. But even though we've got such different, I suppose, beginnings to our faith, there's still a source of the hope that we both have, which is what you keep talking about. It's about Jesus Christ. How did you then, I mean, you mentioned you worked for Christian Concern 15 years. How did you go from, okay, and now I'm going to walk with Jesus, to working for Christian and Christian Concern?
It was somewhat providential in some senses. At university, I studied music. And I say I studied music because honestly, I spent more time reading theology books and these sorts of things than I should have, and being involved in the Christian Union, which is great to do. But I should have taken my other studies a bit more seriously than I did. But that's how it worked out in the end. And from there, I went on and I was kind of interested in potentially working for a church and these sorts of things. I ended up working for my church part-time I worked for my church for 4 months, just after getting married. And then, I became part of a group that was going to plant a church. And one of the other people who was going to plant the church was Andrea Williams, who founded and leads Christian Concern and the Christian Legal Centre. So I was church planting with her. And this was just at the same sort of time as Christian Concern was getting set up. And then when a year or so later, Christian Concern really became an independent organisation and started having to do its own fundraising, and I was no longer working for the church, I started helping out, doing some admin, sorting out some donations, thanking people, and it's just all grown from there over these last 15 years.
And you're clearly loving it. If you're there that long, there's obviously, I mean, I get your excitement of being able to talk to people from completely different sort of, I suppose, faith backgrounds, and yet they're all knowing Jesus from different places, but it's that same single source of hope, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I'd say that back then I was more, I didn't quite see that as much. I was a bit more skeptical of some other kind of traditions of Christianity than I am now, but just kind of working alongside people from different kinds of churches, whether that's kind of Pentecostal churches or more charismatic or less charismatic or Baptist, or just working with so many different types of Christians, but seeing the same heart there. I have certainly grown in terms of generosity of kind of working with other Christians.
I'll share this before we move back to Christian Concern, but I took a year out after school and I worked for something called the PACE movement, which was kind of schools youth worth training. And they're still going around the world, which is great. But I had one conversation with God. I'll do this, Lord, but I'm a Baptist. I'm not going to Pentecostal church. I had a very, very good year at a wonderful Pentecostal church in Manchester, which broke all the stereotypes that somehow I don't even know how they got built up. And I had a fantastic year with some lovely people. And it really softened me in the most wonderful of ways, chipped off all sorts of edges of Pentecostals aren't Baptists. So, and yeah, it was great. But I had this chat with God, and it's funny that I'll do anything, God, but this. And this was very sent me. It was brilliant. Absolutely loved it. Great time. Right, let's move back to Christian concern. I say that to encourage you a little. Let's move back to Christian concern then, because you're working across all sorts of spectrums of struggles and issues. You've mentioned the Christian Legal Centre, the courts. Just what's going on in the world of Christian concern at the moment that maybe we need to know more about?
Well, to give you an overview of the sorts of things that we deal with, I think all of them come back to, in one way or another, to people being made in God's image. So we deal with questions of the protection of life, because we believe the Bible teaches, and we believe this is true, that God gave us dignity. God gave every human inherent dignity because we are made to image Him, and that means that human life, needs to be protected from its smallest stage to its very last stage. And so we deal with quite a few life issues, particularly abortion at one end of that, and trying to resist abortion, but also at the other end, and very relevant at the moment, is at the other end of euthanasia and assisted suicide, which is a bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, as I speak, 9 days' time. And so we're very active in resisting that bill in particular. But it's more than just life. It's to do with the freedom of Christians and others to speak and live out that image. We've been given that dignity and freedom, and part of that involves being free to image Christ wherever we are, to be the images of God wherever we are, which means being Christians not just in the home, and not just at church, but also in the workplace, maybe out on the streets. So being able to live consistent Christian lives wherever we are. And then also, obviously, also means rejecting alternative visions for our nation. I've obviously spoken about how Christianity has been central to this particular nation, but there are rivals in the form of sort of atheistic secularism on one hand, and Islam on another, as other rival visions of what a good nation would look like. So we do work to resist those things. So there are other things to include, so things like education that we work in as well, but that gives an overview of the sorts of issues we deal with. So when it comes to legal cases, for example, lots of those are to do with the freedom of Christians in the workplace, and issues like sex and gender as well come up an awful lot because of the nature of the world and the kind of society we're living in, and how that's at odds with a Christian vision of those things, because we are made male and female in God's image, and that's a kind of crucial part of that. So I've just got on a little bit there, but that gives a wide overview of what we're doing. But particularly at the moment, we're focusing on that assisted suicide issue because it is so foundational to what our nation is going to be like in the next 5, 10, 50 years, if it's passed.
So give us a bit of an overview. What is this about? I mean, I actually chatted to Dr. Trevor Stammers, who I know you know as well, who did a very long video, which is brilliant, because we managed to get into such detail over 55 minutes of what is assisted suicide, what does even the word mean, and we looked through examples around the world. But what's your take on what the assisted suicide bill is about right now here in the UK? I'll say it's 9 days from Parliament being discussed properly, but what's assisted suicide really about here in the UK at this time?
So about this time last year, then we started hearing a very strong campaign from the people who've been supporting assisted suicide and euthanasia for some time, that was really spearheaded by Esther Rantzen, saying, I want, who is nearing the end of her life, and who wants to be able to have what she or they would call an assisted death, or they use the language of assisted dying, which is sometimes confusing to people, because people understand that to be lots of different things, including just general palliative care, the standard kinds of things that is practiced in hospices already. So people think, someone's really near the end of their life. Are we going to keep on treating them with every possible treatment we can do, throwing stuff at them, or do we withdraw some of the treatment when it's clear it's not going to work? Christians that's completely fine to withdraw treatment when that's the right time. But what we are talking about with the assisted dying conversation is about giving people something that actually accelerates and causes the death, rather than just allows the death to happen. So it's about giving essentially poison to someone, whether that's by assisted suicide, where the patient does it themselves, or whether it's by a doctor doing it for them, which is called euthanasia normally. So that's all happened. And then Labour wins the election, and Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, had promised that he would give time to discuss assisted suicide in Parliament. And so when the private members' bills, which are the bills that go through Parliament that aren't led directly by the government, that aren't part of the government's actual own agenda, when basically there's a ballot and all the different MPs in Parliament can try to get their own private members' bills, and they're all pulled out in a random order, and the ones that come first get an opportunity basically to push something through Parliament. Kim Leadbeater is the person who came top of that. She's a Labour MP, and she was persuaded, it seems, to spearhead this assisted suicide bill, which is not called the assisted suicide bill or the assisted dying bill, but has a more hard to understand name, which I even forgotten myself, which is something like the terminally ill brackets end of life bill. But what it would do is it allow people to receive deliberate help from a medical professional to end their life if they are supposedly, I mean, this is what it purports, if they are 6 months from death. Now, there are all kinds of problems with that, which we could go into, but that's roughly what is going on.
I know, chatting to Trevor about this, he said one of the things that we've seen, particularly in Canada, where they've been much further ahead pushing for this. He said it's the use of some of the terminology, I suppose, to try and soften it. So we don't say killing a baby. What we say is abortion, and then because that's a bit harsh, well, we say it's terminating. So we use language, what he was saying, to try and soften what it is we're saying. It doesn't change the actual reality of the outcome, but by going from killing a baby, which sounds terrible, through to abortion, which doesn't sound very good, to termination, which is then removing it from the baby because it's terminating a pregnancy, then we can separate living from something, and then it gets supposedly easier to make decisions. But this is why he was saying that even the wording, we need to understand what the wording actually means, because the words are used to soften what is actually going on.
And to confuse the public, it seems, because when we've seen polls in recent years where then they will say a huge percentage of the population supports assisted dying, but then when you ask them what assisted dying means to them, then often lots of them don't know what it actually means, and they only support a portion of it. They don't actually support the principle. So yes, it's there to confuse as well.
And of course, here in the UK, I don't know about any other nations, but I know in the UK, it used to be a criminal offence to commit suicide. Now, we can debate, well, that's silly because they're already dead, so how can they be prosecuted? But that is the view the law took, which is that this is a wrong thing to do. So what we're talking about is changing it is a really wrong thing to do to now all of a sudden it's okay. Where are we actually at as a country? Is it allowed now? Is it about to be allowed? Whereabouts in the sort of the conversation of we want to be able to do this? Are we? Because I know that with law, particularly, it often catches up. It's not really leading; it's usually just behind what's going on. So where are we actually at in the UK now?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the Suicide Act, which is the primary place where assisting someone to commit suicide is an offence. So assisting anyone to commit suicide is an offence in the United Kingdom, according to the Suicide Act. That is what this bill would change. So it would change that particular point. As things stand, that is upheld, except for cases where people are taking people abroad to clinics, like famously Dignitas in Switzerland, where it's possible, because in Switzerland and some other countries, then it is possible to do this legally. And the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland accepts people from overseas. So we had a complicated situation in 2010, I believe, or thereabouts, where the courts ruled that that pursuing prosecution, I think this is right, the courts ruled that pursuing the prosecution of those people who are just taking someone to Switzerland to help them end their lives would not be in the public interest. And so the person then tasked with creating new guidelines to say when it would be in the public's interest to prosecute people of this nature. The person in charge of doing those was Sir Keir Starmer before he started his political career. So he actually laid out the guidelines that would say when it's okay to do that. So basically trying to not prosecute people where it was all consensual, but if there was someone who seemed to be coerced into doing this, they would still be prosecuted. So that has been the case for essentially on the ground for the last 10 years or so. And then that becomes the argument for the people who are for assisted suicide at the moment, because they say, well, people can do it anyway because they can just go to Switzerland. And that's legal to go to Switzerland. Why should we be forced to go to Switzerland? Why at the end of our hard lives, which they are hard lives, why should we at this really difficult time have to go to Switzerland away from our family, away from other people? And why is it the preserve only of people who can afford to go to Switzerland and pay £10,000 to do this? Why should only those people be able to get this assisted death? And so that's been part of their argument, that essentially this is available already. So why should it only be for those people?
I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind is assisted suicide, irrespective of the language, what we're talking about in this bill, regardless of what it may be named, is speeding up somebody's death by their own personal choice. As Christians, there's a lot of scripture which would suggest, well, we're not supposed to do that because actually life is precious, and either it is precious or it isn't. There isn't a grey middle ground of, well, sometimes it is less precious. That doesn't, sit with scripture. But as Christians, how worried do we need to be? We're talking about this going into Parliament in 9 days. Not what's the legal process, but what kind of timeframes are we talking about from 9 days before it gets properly discussed to when people can start killing other people, and we're going to say, yeah, this is a really good idea as a nation? Whereabouts we are in that timeline? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So if MPs vote for this bill on next Friday, the 29th of November, then it will continue through Parliament, and it's a bit hard to say exactly what will happen then if it's passed. So that's one reason why we just really want to do everything we can to stop this at this point. But essentially, theoretically, MPs will continue to discuss it and refine the bill, change the safeguards, these sorts of things, and then they get another chance at the third reading, which may be 3 or 4 months from now, maybe, to say, yes, we want to keep on going ahead with this, or no, we haven't managed to do this properly. So it's not the absolute end of the road if that's the case. But then if that's passed, then it would go through the House of Lords as well, which would also have opportunities to change things, but not really to stop it. And then you'd see potentially it getting royal assent and becoming law sometime later on in 2025. And then probably starting to happen from the following April, or maybe beyond that. It's a bit hard to guess, but you're talking about a year and a half from now, maybe that it could start coming into effect. The bill and its proponents would say that this would only happen in very severe cases, and they claim that there are lots of good safeguards. There aren't. It's impossible to create good safeguards for this. But what you've seen in other countries, and particularly Canada, which is the most chilling of all, is that as soon as you open that door to say that some lives aren't worth living, then and that principle is given away, then you just end up opening the door very, very quickly to all kinds of other things. The rate at which it's expanded in Canada is absolutely alarming, and Canada is somewhat similar to us in some respects culturally. They've had an enormous increase of deaths by this method. It's taking over from palliative care in certain ways. You get probably about 10% of all deaths by now are actually happening by euthanasia or assisted suicide there. It's not just this fringe situation for people in particularly agonizing pain. It's just become normal there. and it shows no chance of kind of declining. It's just new different things. They were even going to allow it for only mental health conditions. So they're going to say that say in about 2 years' time that you can have nothing wrong with you physically. You just have mental health conditions and you want to end your life. You can do it through this method, which I think sends an awful, awful message to everyone who's struggling with depression, anxiety, anything like, or any other kind of personality disorder. What a horrible message to send, to say, well, basically, we agree that your life's not worth living. Here's a way of ending it. It's just a terrible message.
Some of this coming to mind, which might seem a little bit weird to start with, but we had a business in Shrewsbury going back 15 years. Shrewsbury, sort of near Wales-ish, middle of the UK. And we had a shop and it was all going fine. And then there was a lap dancing club proposal. Churches all said, yeah, we're going to pray against this. We don't want a lap dancing club in the heart of Shrewsbury city centre. And then it got to planning, and then the council said, we have no choice but to grant this. We don't want to, but it's going ahead. At which point all the churches then said, well, nothing we can do. We're just going to back off now. A tiny group of us said, well, what's planning to God? Okay, it's got approval, it's going ahead, but let's keep praying. So we did. And various sets of circumstances. I was an ex-trucker who was selling cloth nappies in the middle of Shrewsbury in a shop. The local paper loved us. We got a full-page spread. I basically copied everything from Camden Borough Council, pretty much rich off what they've been saying about all the problems. Didn't mention Christianity, God won't. I mentioned industry, I mentioned commerce, and I mentioned money and the problems to the local area. And the lap dancing got pulled. Council couldn't stop it, but the landlord read it and said, this is dreadful. I had no idea because of what I'd written, which wasn't that clever. And then he pulled the plug and we got the shop that was supposed to be the restaurant to the lap dancing club. I share that because it's never too late to get these things stopped. And assisted suicide, it feels like it's such a massive train right now. Well, it's going to happen. Look at Canada, look at Switzerland. However, we serve a God who's bigger. Which gives me hope.
Absolutely. I mean, if you'd asked me 2-3 months ago what our chances were of stopping this bill, I'd have said very small. It felt David and Goliath. There was very little chance. In the last 2 months, I've seen so many answers to prayer in terms of how things have gone, in terms of people raising their voices unexpectedly. Someone like Wes Streeting, the health secretary, being really clear that he's the man who's in charge of the NHS essentially, and he's saying, don't think we should do this, and he's being vocal about it. So thank you to him. But lots of other figures unexpectedly coming out and saying we don't think this is a good idea. So it looks a lot more in the balance than it might have been.
I think I read, was it a former judge? I've forgotten the title of the person, but very senior judge, saying basically there are no safeguards. I've looked at this. There are zero safeguards. This is impossible to police at any level. Therefore, this should be scrapped before we even begin, because there is absolutely no way that this bill is going to safeguard anybody from coercion. And if that's not in place, how can we in any way as a civilized society let this go forwards? Because there are no actual protections.
That's right. I forget which judge it is, but I've read that as well.
You read that as well.
There was also a very interesting interview with one of the supporters of the bill that was done by Victoria Derbyshire on BBC the other day, where just very simple questions about the safeguards were being asked, and they had no answers. How is a doctor going to spot coercion? Are GPs trained in spotting coercion around this issue? But they'd be the main ones who'd be referring it. There are no safeguards in this bill relating to that, and there are so many other holes that are there. Another thing is this bill would require judges to sign off on it. High Court judges would have to sign off on every single one of these. If you look at the numbers of assisted suicides that have gone on anywhere else, then you would see far more cases than the High Court could handle, and they would be all treated as urgent, which would absolutely wreck the High Court system. So every other case would be essentially delayed and pushed back. It's completely unworkable. It's a meaningless safeguard. So as soon as it came into action, then everyone would be immediately saying, "Oh well, this doesn't work. We're going to have to just sign these off anyway. We're just going to make it a paper thing, and we just sign it off quickly." It would be so unworkable that it is a meaningless safeguard. And so MPs need to understand that before they vote for it, because they need to understand that these safeguards cannot work.
The other obvious question, which I think I need to ask, is as a person who describes themselves as Christian here in the UK, why should we oppose this particular bill?
Because we love our neighbour, ultimately. Because if you look at, for example, Canada and all of these other places that it has happened, it affects vulnerable people. You have 30 to 40% in Oregon and Canada of the people who are opting to do this, who believe that for whom one of the motivations for doing it is that they feel like they're a burden on other people. And people near the end of their lives, people who are elderly, do feel they don't even need to be told anything. No one needs to say anything to them. They feel like a burden often anyway. And when you're saying that that's a legitimate reason for ending your life, then it's you can see very quickly how it's going to affect vulnerable people. And in our bill, the way that it's set up in the UK, doctors will be able to suggest it. Well, you could go for a series of you could go through chemotherapy, but there is also this assisted suicide option for you if you want it. I mean, that's going to affect people. That's going to lead people into it who wouldn't have otherwise done it. And then, obviously, as Christians, we also wanted to say that there should be extra motivation for Christians, not just because of loving our neighbour, although that's a very good thing to do. Like you said, it's not our right to do it. That's another point to make. But also just think about the practicalities of it. So if you're a Christian and you're going through assisted suicide, then it's very clear from the Bible that you shouldn't be doing that. So that's not good for you. What about for non-Christians? Is that actually compassionate to end someone's life early if they're not a Christian? Well, for those of us who believe in heaven and hell and for the possibility of an eternity with Christ or without Christ, then speeding up the end of life and leading someone to suicide who's not a Christian, you are removing the opportunity for them to repent and believe in Christ and to have an eternity with him. And so even though it may appear on the surface compassionate, you're ending some level of suffering at that moment, it's clearly not, because they're missing out on an eternity with Christ. It's not true compassion, and so we should oppose it.
Yes, fine. What else is going on in the world of Christian concern? I know we've talked about assisted suicide, but have you got any other topics that are particularly relevant right now that people really do need to know about?
Well, one of the biggest stories that we're involved in at the moment is the case of the Darlington nurses. These are, in particular, 4 nurses at a hospital up in Darlington, who are amongst many nurses, but these particular 4 have raised this issue a lot higher. And the issue is that there is a male who is being allowed to use their changing room, who identifies as transgender, as a woman to some degree, but he has a girlfriend. He's sexually active and looking to start a family, etc. So this is not a typical situation that people might imagine of someone who is identifying as a woman in a very full sense. But this person is being allowed to use their changing room, and they and 20 odd more nurses are really concerned about his presence in the changing room. They've shared a lot about how he's made them feel uncomfortable in various ways. And yet, because of NHS policies and the hospital policies, he is continuing to be allowed to use the changing room, and anyone who doesn't want to share the changing rooms with him are being forced to go into somewhere else. So they're really raising this issue of why should men be allowed to make us feel uncomfortable and unable to use our changing rooms. And it's gone very big. We've had over 48,000 people sign a petition to Wes Streeting again. There we go, the health secretary, to say this isn't reasonable. Various people like J.K. Rowling have got involved and kind of supported them, and Wes Streeting himself has actually now met with the nurses to see if this can be fixed.
It just to be really careful. It throws up so many questions. Even like allowing the NHS to discuss suicide when we're talking about allowing a man to be in a woman's changing room, it makes even me think, but why would we trust you to make decisions about killing somebody or not? Because if you're letting a man be in a woman's changing rooms when they're really uncomfortable with that, how sensible can you really be, or dispassionate, I suppose, at making really, really wise decisions about even more important things? Because as tragic as it is for those nurses, we're talking about with the assisted suicide bill ending somebody's life, which is the ultimate taking away of anything, not diminishing their suffering. But if you can't get this right, how can why would we trust you over there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is one thing that's come up in actually quite a lot of other situations as well. The difference between people who sort of think that as long as we have the right processes and these sorts of things, then we can run things well and we can make it all work. There are some people who are very optimistic about these sorts of things, who, for example, support assisted suicide, thinking that the safeguard's going to work, even though they're full of holes. And similarly, this sort of thing where just a case of fixing this policy here. I mean, another example is the tragic situation in the Church of England and beyond of safeguarding failures, where there are people who know about grossly evil, terrible things that have happened, but people want to protect their institution, or they just don't want to be the person who comes out and says something and who raises an issue and puts their head above the parapet and might face consequences because of it. Institutions and people are flawed, and we mess up these sorts of things all the time. Why would we put even more power, and the power of life and death in the case of assisted suicide, in the hands of people who are flawed? Like, we cannot get things right as much as we think.
Coming back to the situation with the nurses from Darlington, so that's, as you say, that's northeast of England. Where are we at now? Are they still being told you're going to have to share a changing room and get undressed in front of a bloke? Is that where they're still being? Where are we at with that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, they have got an alternative room that they can use. It is a single space changing room. I mean, similar sort of size locker to, like, similar size area to what you might have a swimming pool. It's just a small little changing room like that one person can use at a time. There are I think there were initially 26 nurses who complained to the hospital about this situation. So if you imagine all those 26, they're not all going to be on shift at the same time, but you imagine them all needing to use the changing rooms. It's not very practical, considering all the things. They could, of course, if the policies were right, if they wanted to, they could say, look, here are other changing areas that you can use as you identify as a transgender woman, and so you don't want to use the male changing rooms. We understand that, but you can have this single. You could do that and protect the female only spaces for all these women nurses, but that's not what has been chosen. Instead, it's the larger number of people who often have very, very reasonable reasons why they don't want to share that changing space. It's them who are having to work around all of this.
I was going to say, excuse my ignorance, but why can't the bloke who's got an issue with struggling with whatever they think they are or not, why can they not use the one that's for one person? That's my first question: is there not one space that could be used that they could use, so the greater majority are not being put through so much turmoil? Is that a dumb question? It's just the one that comes to mind.
I mean, that's what everyone in their right mind is thinking about this situation. I don't know whether it's specific NHS policies that make that impossible for the hospital, or whether it's just a lack of will. We've certainly we're supporting the nurses as they try to make that very point. They've set up the Darlington Nursing Union to support people in these sorts of situations as an actual union and be able to go into discussions with employers and these sorts of things. And they have provided some guidance on the law that would show how it would be possible to make that change. So they've supported that exact sort of thing in the guidance that they've sent through to Wes Streeting, and we just have to hope that common sense prevails on that point, and that he sees it through.
I get uncomfortable if I have to go into one of the, I'm going to be honest, the really stupidly designed single-sex toilet things. Even that makes me really uncomfortable as a bloke walking in thinking, Well, I know they're all like closed off cubicles, but I'm still uncomfortable. Like, can I not have a male only space? Because I would much prefer that. And it's not, oh, I'm just old and it's tradition. No, I just prefer going into a toilet area with a bunch of blokes because I know how they function, I know how they work. Even I would think, well, I don't like it. And I was at one recently where it's a a unisex toilet area, which is huge, but it's all cubicles and they're not fully closed off. And it made me very, very uneasy and thinking, can I hold it? Can I go and find a wall and we there? I'd feel more comfortable, to be honest. Go and break the law outside would feel more natural to me than being here. That's how much I feel. And that's just going to the loo, which is private. These are nurses who are actually going to get, I'm guessing, undressed and dressed at the start of the day into work uniform, out of work uniform. And it kind of, so basically we're in the middle of a place where we don't quite know what's going to happen next with this.
Yes, so they've made their point. They've met with Wes Streeting. We just have to wait to see if anything actually comes of that. He's possibly a bit busy with the assisted suicide and other issues at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously running the NHS is a huge responsibility, but we really hope he does continue to see this through and that we see meaningful change on this issue.
I'm trying not to make sort of one-off silly statements here, but it just defies logic that 26 nurses are being made so queasy and uncomfortable. And I can understand one portion of that because I was in a unisex toilet the other day, which I really didn't like. But when, this is more than that, and these are people's lives, and we need those nurses to function well. And if they got mental health issues because they're being stressed at work, then they can't perform as well. It just, my little brain, I'm thinking, come on, let's think this through. Let's try and help them. If someone is really confused about who they are, okay, but put them in a single room so that it's not affecting everybody quite so tragically, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean that's a normal thing for you, and I think that women would feel that generally more intensively in terms of being forced to use unisex kind of shared changing rooms, toilet areas with men, because there is this discrepancy in terms of men and women. Men tend to be bigger and stronger and tend to have a history of violence and all kinds of things towards women in general, and so there are good reasons why they'd be even more uncomfortable for that. One of the nurses has said involved in this was sexually abused as a child, and
wow.
And the situation caused panic attacks for her.
Yeah.
And the man who identifies with the name Rose, while alone in the changing room, said, "Are you getting changed yet?" to her. This sort of thing was happening. It's absolutely unbelievable. You can read about it on our website, but in response to the nurses complaining, then the HR department and senior management said they needed to be re-educated, broaden their mindset, and be more inclusive.
Okay, so there's lots going on. Christian Concern is involved in lots of places. Some of this stuff, I find it hard to know how to respond in a sensible manner because I listen and I think, how? I mean, in a sense, how have we got there? I mean, I can sort of understand some of it, but at the same time, seriously, can somebody just take a step back and have a look? Because do you see how horrid you're actually being through your actions of defending an individual? And I've always said the same thing: inclusivity always excludes people. It just will. Once you include people to one extent, you're going to exclude others. It's the way that we will function as people, unless we have Jesus Christ as a source of hope and reason and rationality in our minds. And I do think God is a very rational, logical person. His logic might be different to us, but some of this stuff, it kind of defies logic, mostly because it totally defies logic. Right.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And like you say, this is coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning in a sense, but I was talking about how the law, is based on Christian principles. And so is our desire for compassion and to treat people who are vulnerable well, or people who are outsiders. We naturally, as Christians, want to, we don't want to be mean to them or cruel to them. And so someone like Rose in that situation, we don't want to be horrible to him. We want to see him come to terms with who he really is and who he is male. We'll have to see that. We don't want him. No one in the situation is asking for him to even be punished or like anything bad to happen to him. They just want to have their safe changing rooms,
Yeah.
where they're not being made to feel uncomfortable by him. It's not a personal attack on anyone, and yet it can often be portrayed as that. and it's really comes back to, Christianity is the grounds for compassion that we have in our society, and we want to treat people well because of the influence of Christianity over the years, over the centuries, and so we need more of that.
Amen to all of that. How can people reach out to you, whether they want to find out more what you're involved in, or perhaps they want some help themselves? What's the route for that?
Well, our website's christianconcern.com, and you can join us. The best thing to do is sign up to our email list, which you'll find links to do on that website. So that's to find out about Christian Concern in general. You'll see also on the homepage in particular, there's an action article sort of thing, which tells you all the things you can do relating to assisted suicide, which is the really urgent thing at the moment. I would say it's the most important thing I've done in my 15 years at Christian Concern to put it in context. It's such a big issue at the moment. So I'd really urge people to go along there, click on that link and find out more about it and see what action they can take. And one particular thing we'd love people to do is on the 29th of November to join us outside Parliament, where we'll be just trying to make clear to MPs that there really are a lot of people who aren't going along with this and who want to stand for life and oppose assisted suicide.
If we don't speak up and honour the defence, the freedoms that we have, then they will, as we are seeing, disappear. Paul from christianconcern.com, thank you for sharing some of this stuff. And if you want to know more, christianconcern.com is where you need to go. Paul, thank you.
Thanks.
Rated 5 stars by Sorted Magazine's film critic, Pure 247 takes you behind the scenes of the birth of a global Christian radio station. Andy B will have you laughing and crying as you discover what it takes to create ministry that matters in this inspiring tale of perseverance, honesty and vulnerability. Buckle up and get ready for a story that's uplifting as it is entertaining. Behind the microphone, they face bankruptcy, eviction, and 2 life-changing surgeries. Can they make it? Will they make it? Get your copy of this life-changing book today. Pure 247 is available now on Amazon. Andy B is best described as a man after God's own heart, who insists that God's vision and resourcing trump all handicaps.